Hello, this is Dave Palmer here. I'm recording from my daughter's bedroom in Leverett, Massachusetts in the days of quarantine. I'm a bit of a novice when it comes to Zoom technologies, so you'll have to bear with me if I struggle with some of these controls. I am recently retired from Smith College after 30 years as their token behaviorist. And now I list my affiliation as with the B.F. Skinner Foundation, of which I am a board member. My interests are largely theoretical and fairly abstract, and but I hope to be able to provide something of value to people whose interests are primarily pragmatic. People, almost everyone at the conference is vaguely familiar, at least, with Skinner's contribution, verbal behavior, because it plays a large role in the remediation of children with language disabilities or language deficits. But most people's familiarity with the book lies in the concepts of the operant classes, texts and mans and interverbals and textual behavior and echoics and so on. So much so that people tend to think that this is the book. The book is all about trying to decide what kind of an operant this particular instance of behavior is. But Skinner's book is much richer than that, and so I'm hoping to provide a kind of guided tour to the chapters that lie beyond the elementary verbal operants, and it may spare you the trouble of reading the book, or it may inspire you to take another whack at reading it yourself. The outline of my talk will run as follows. I'm going to start with how to actually read the book if you're so inclined. Many people don't want to read the book. They're mainly interested in applied matters, and they don't feel that they need to read the book. But if you're interested in reading the book, I think it will be helpful to go over some strategies for reading the book. Then I'm going to turn to two concepts: the concept of response probability, which Skinner covers in chapters 2 and 10, and the additivity of stimulus control in those same chapters. Now, these are topics that you probably have not come across much, but it turns out that they will be quite fundamental and actually of considerable use to you as practitioners or as theorists, as the case may be. They are a necessary foundation for talking about what comes later. In chapters 8 and all of chapters 9 through 11, Skinner discusses the concept of multiple control, which is an extremely important concept, and I'll just prefigure it here by alluding to it, but not going into it. Next, we'll turn to autoclitic frames, chapters 12 through 14. The word autoclitic is a technical term in Skinner's vocabulary, and you've probably heard of the word and not really understood what it was because nobody really understands what it is. I try to avoid using the word as much as possible because it's more likely to yield confusion than anything else. The concepts involved, however, are quite clear and appropriate for anyone with either pragmatic or theoretical interests. They play a huge role. These frames play a huge role in sequences of verbal behavior. So when we go beyond individual words to chains of words or patterns of words, grammar, and so on, we need to talk about this topic. The concept of automatic reinforcement, Skinner discusses all throughout the book in scattered places, but especially in two pages that I've identified here. Automatic reinforcement is reinforcement that's mediated by the individual. That is, we find reinforcing, maybe if we're if we're a guitar player, we might be strumming away on the guitar and pick out a few chords that sound good to us. Well, that would be an instance of automatic reinforcement. Or if you're playing darts and you throw the dart in a particular way and it hits the bullseye, that's automatically reinforcing. That is, you don't need the encouragement of a teacher or a parent or a sibling to reinforce the behavior. The last two topics, the speaker as listener and conditioning the behavior of the listener, are fairly subtle ones, and we may not even have time to get into them, but we should recognize, at least as Skinner does in chapters 14 through 19, that the speaker himself or herself can hear themselves speaking and can detect as listeners that they've goofed. Uh-oh, I said Albany, I meant New York City. We can respond to our own verbal behavior as we are speaking. And this has some implications for both pragmatic matters and theoretical matters. Conditioning the behavior of the listener is an extremely important topic, but it's one that's not very well understood. And we will, I hope, have time to briefly allude to this topic as well. But Skinner discusses this in chapter 14, especially in these 10 pages that I've outlined here. So moving ahead to how to read verbal behavior, again, assuming that you have some interest in doing so, and I encourage people to do so, but those who have purely practical interests may feel that it's just too obscure a book for their purposes and they can get what they need elsewhere. And that may be, but Skinner is the fountainhead of all this practical stuff that we do in this field. Skinner wrote for colleagues that were fellow members of the Society of Fellows in Harvard in 1934. They were skeptical that a behavioral account of verbal behavior was even possible. All these guys were educated in the 1890s or early 1900s. They all had to take Latin, and they all read Macbeth and Julius Caesar and had to memorize long passages from John Milton and so on. Verbal behavior, the book Verbal Behavior, is laced with these esoteric literary references, esoteric to us, because his audience was this group of eggheads at Harvard who were skeptical of Skinner's enterprise. So he wrote to their repertoire, and education isn't like what it was 100 years ago. So some of the literary references will be obscure to us, are obscure to us. Furthermore, the analysis assumes a familiarity with laboratory findings in animal behavior. And it attempts an analysis in those terms and in only those terms. And this sets Skinner's book apart from all other tracts on language there are out there. His thesis is that language is behavior. You might say, well, of course it's behavior. It's behavior, and it's subject to the same principles as all other behavior. It's behavior like other behavior and should be analyzed with the principles of behavior. Now, that's not a thesis that is, or an assumption that is widely held outside of the field of behavior analysis. Nevertheless, I'm sure Skinner is right. But it was a new idea. In any case, the book isn't an easy read, partly because of its historical context and Skinner's penchant for going into obscure historical and literary veins. If you pick up the book and you find that you have to force yourself to keep reading, that's a bad sign. It means that the book is not reinforcing, and it's almost certain that you won't get through it if you have to force yourself to read it. Reminiscent of, years in college when you had to read these god-awful textbooks. And in any case, let me give you some other advice. If possible, read Mark Sundberg's chapter on verbal behavior in the Cooper, Heron, and Heward Bible of Applied Behavior Analysis, if you have access to that book. If you don't have access to it, there's a consultant in your life, chances are they have the book and they might be willing to loan you the book or Xerox that chapter. Or you could write to Mark and ask for a paper version of the chapter. When the ideas are familiar, Mark's chapter is very readable. The ideas will be familiar, and then reading Skinner will be, in a sense, like reading it a second time, and easier to digest for that reason. But I discourage people from starting on page 1 and treating it like a novel where you start on the first page and read everything in order. The reason that I discourage that is that, again, Skinner wasn't writing for you and me. He was writing for these guys, these skeptics. So although these first chapters are extremely important conceptually, they aren't helpful to the novice who is more interested in the nitty-gritty of the analysis. So I would start with chapter 4. I strongly encourage this. Chapter 4 is full of topics that are familiar to you, and much of it is intuitive. So he talks about the echoic behavior, repeating the verbal behavior of another, textual behavior, which is roughly translated as reading, transcriptive behavior, writing, interverbal behavior, responding to what you might think of as memorized strings, like Mary had a little lamb would be an interverbal response to Mary had a. So any kind of familiar sequence of verbal behavior will tend to evoke subsequent bits of that verbal behavior. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the Republic, and so on. It's all interverbal, controlled by the immediate antecedent. As I say, this is intuitive and familiar. It's not simply giving new words for old concepts, however. Textual behavior is the behavior of saying the text that's in front of you, or saying it silently to yourself. Reading is an activity. When we read, if we're reading a detective novel, we're excited. We're anxious when the detective is in trouble, and we're trying to solve the puzzle before the end of the book, and so on. Reading is much more than merely saying the words. Textual behavior is the saying of the words. So Skinner is breaking it down into its molecular parts. So when he says something is a textual, he doesn't mean, well, it's almost inevitable that the textual behavior will evoke much discriminative responding. But the textual itself is the act, the behavior of speaking under the control of a text, out loud or to yourself. He classifies things by their function, not by their topography. So the word fish could be attacked, or it could be a manned, or it could be echoic, or it could be interverbal, and so on. These four elementary verbal operants may seem trivial, but in fact they play a very important role in education. So it's a good place to start because you'll feel on familiar ground, and you won't have any difficulty with the chapter. Then go back and read the introductory pages, and only the introductory pages, of the chapters on the man, the tact, and the audience, chapters 3, 4, and 7. Skinner goes on at great length into all kinds of varieties and implications of these concepts. And those are of interest, but when you're when you're struggling with a book, stop when you're stop at a natural stopping place, which is the first few pages. After he's explained what the man is, after he's explained what the tact is, and you understand the concept, you're going to stop under my direction. You're going to skip ahead to chapters 9 and 10. Chapter 9 is on multiple control. See, the reason I'm having you skip ahead to chapters 9 and 10 is if you try to read through the entire tact chapter before getting to chapter 9, you might never get to chapter 9. I want you to skip ahead, see how all these things come together. Multiple control reminds us of the complexity of control at any moment, and even the simplest of verbal responses is under multiple control. The question isn't, is it a man or is it a tact, but what are the various controlling variables? Chapter 10 is on prompting, and this is something which will be familiar and of interest to people with pragmatic concerns. And again, you might never get to chapter 10 if you start at the beginning, simply because there's so much in the book that is dry and, for practical purposes, rather lifeless. For eggheads, it's wonderful, but you want to be ready for that eggheadedness. So I suggest going back to the beginning after reading chapters 9 and 10. Don't go on to the chapters on the autoclitic, chapter 14 and so on, until you're familiar with the first half of the book. Furthermore, go back to the beginning, but when you come to a difficult passage, if you find you're bored, just skip ahead. You can skip ahead a few paragraphs to the end of the section, to the end of the chapter. Skip ahead until the text becomes clear again, as it invariably will. Verbal behavior is not uniformly difficult. It's like walking around a track, and every now and then you come to a hurdle. Some hurdles are low and some hurdles are high. If you come to a high hurdle, it's too high, just walk around it and keep on walking. Because this happens to everybody. It's no shame in skipping over stuff that you're not finding reinforcing. The important thing is to keep on going. And you will find that there are treasures all the way along the track, and they don't necessarily have to be taken in order. Skinner, in fact, recognized that reading a difficult text requires its own analysis. And he suggested that in our first reading of a difficult text, we can understand the individual words, but can't say the same thing in our own words. It's purely textual behavior. The second reading strengthens interverbal links, and so we might now be able to memorize what we're reading, but only in the sense of memorizing Hamlet, where we know the words, but we don't necessarily know what they mean. But continuing to reread, definitions will allow us to substitute the definition for unfamiliar terms, and we begin to kind of rewrite the text in our own words. Predication is this business of bringing part of a sentence together with another part of a sentence. Predication allows us to tie together concepts that occur in sentences, perhaps for the first time, bringing the familiar part together with the unfamiliar part. When we're able to respond discriminatively to all of it, we can say that we understand it. Skinner says that the process is like trying to decipher bad handwriting. Our only recourse is to reread until we find ourselves, this is a quote, we find ourselves making a plausible response under the control of other variables. The result of simple rereading is that we come to make responses not simply as textual behavior, but for other reasons. Again, textual behavior is the behavior of reading the text. The evocative effect of what we read goes beyond textual behavior. I have an example here of reading something which is extremely difficult to read, not because the concepts are difficult, but because the handwriting is abominable. This is a deed written in 1790 between Abel Clary and Gideon Lee of Amherst. And I've extracted a little bit here. I had to transcribe this deed for some reason or another that I won't get into. And what I had to do was simply go over it and over it and over it and over it. And Skinner's little analysis a few slides ago is quite right. At first, I couldn't make head nor tail of it, but now I can read it as easily as I can. Well, I can read it somewhat. Reading the handwritten part, this first word here in the upper left, the first handwritten word in the upper left, is the word two, T-W-O. Well, it doesn't look anything like the word T-W-O at first, but then you recognize that that ornate circular thing is just somebody's idea of a capital T, and then you can make out the W and O that follow. And you know it's two because it reads, two certain tracts of land situate and being in leveret above said, bounded as followeth, viz., beginning at a stake in stones, the south side of the town way, a little west of the house and the premises, then south 7 degrees west, 25 rods to a stake in stones on Elisha Cleary's land, then west 10 degrees south, and so on and so on. It all starts to hang together once you get to know, once you start to make responses, once you realize that the S's look like F's. This is the word nursery, for example. It's a process of teaching yourself to read the text. So those are my hints for how to read verbal behavior, and I hope that those are of some value to anyone who's going to tackle the book. I think they will be of value to that group that is thinking of tackling the book, because recognizing that a frontal assault is not the way to go. Hardly anybody finds the book an easy read starting on page 1 and going all the way to page 470. So I want to deal with a couple of, I'm going to turn now to the notion of the probability of a response. And I wanted to start by talking about the concept of a response, It's behavioristic lingo. It just means a unit of behavior. It's left over from the days when all behavior was interpreted as reflexive. So a flash of light to the eye causes your pupil to constrict. That's a reflex. The flash is a stimulus and the pupil constriction is a response to the stimulus. A tap on your patellar tendon causes your leg to kick. The stimulus causes a response, A touch of lemon to the tongue elicits salivation. These are all responses to the stimulus. What is the capital of Turkmenistan? Well, you probably don't know the capital of Turkmenistan. I didn't know until I looked it up. It's Ashgabat. Well, is that a response? It's not a reflexive response. In a sense, it's a response to a question. The point is it's a unit of behavior. And we call it a response only because pupil constriction, leg extension, salivation are clearly responses to a stimulus. Ashgabat, in a sense, is a response to the capital of Turkmenistan, but it's not a reflexive response. It's a learned response, but we still call it a response. What would you like to drink? Milk. Well, in a sense, that's a response. But suppose I want to write something, and I look around and I have a cup with pens and pencils in it, and I reach for my pen. Well, that's not a response to the pen. It's not a response I make to pens in general. I don't reach for the pen unless I want the pen. I don't reach for the pen unless I have to write something. So it's not simply a response to a pen the same way that salivation is a response to a touch of lemon. Nevertheless, we call it a response. And that's just our verbal habit, but it sounds a little strange to people who aren't in the sort of behaviorism business. So as I say, we call them all responses, even though an elicited response in a reflexive context is a much more natural meaning of the term response. I need to talk about the concept of the repertoire. The repertoire is not a place, it's not a thing, it's not a container, but we talk about behavior in our repertoire. It's just a summary term that embraces all of the effects of our history. To say that a response is in one's repertoire just means that it can be evoked under some set of conditions. So it's a summary term that represents our learning history. So the word cabbage is in my repertoire, but the Tibetan word for cabbage is not in my repertoire. And now you might say, well, does that mean Ashgabat was in your repertoire an hour ago? Because you were able to say it? And the answer is no. Ashgabat was not in your repertoire. It may be in your repertoire now, but it was not then. Unless by chance it was. The textual and echoic elements were in your repertoire. That is, when I say Ashgabat, you can say Ashgabat after me. You're not saying, the unit of response here is not Ashgabat, it's Ashgabat, or maybe you sounded it out by reading the text. And this illustrates the importance of Skinner's analysis. The textual response, Ashgabat, or the echoic response, Ashgabat after hearing Ashgabat, is not the same as saying Ashgabat to what is the capital of Turkmenistan. So the individual speech sounds were in your repertoire an hour ago. Now the sequence of speech sounds, Ashgabat as a unit, is in your repertoire, at least briefly, under the control of what is the capital of Turkmenistan. The number of units of behavior in the repertoire of a typical adult is simply incalculable. We have zillions and zillions and zillions of behavioral elements in our repertoire, in the sense that our learning history encompasses everything we've done since birth, and much of that has been retained as behavior that we can emit under different conditions. So we have gazillion units of behavior in our repertoire, but at any moment, only a few such responses are likely to occur. So a waitress says, "Would you like something to drink with your dinner?" And there are a few responses that are quite likely. If you are accustomed to drinking wine with dinner, you might ask for the wine list. If you don't like alcohol, you might ask for water or iced tea. Or if you might like a beer. All of these things are possible responses that come that are plausible in this particular context. Those are the ones that have some probability of occurring. Many others are lower on the list, but there are uncountably many responses in your repertoire that have such a infinitesimal probability of occurring. If the waitress says, "Would you like something to drink with your dinner?" you're extremely unlikely to say Ashgabat, for example. Extremely unlikely. Although, my having brought it to your attention, maybe it will happen next time. Your poor waitress. So, turning to the concept of response probability, remember that the term response just means a unit of behavior. Response probability is the central theoretical term. I don't know if my picture is, if what you see is what I see, but my picture is obscuring part of the title here. But nevertheless, response probability is the central theoretical term in Skinner's analysis of behavior. We say that reinforcement increases the probability of a response in the presence of a stimulus. Unlike, say, blinking to a flash of light or a puff of air in our eye, or a stick jabbing us under the eye, blinking is also somewhat probabilistic, but the the relationship between eliciting stimulus and the response is nearly 1-to-1. Put lemon on our tongue, we salivate. But reinforcement doesn't have that kind of switch-like effect on behavior. It simply increases the probability of a response in the presence of a stimulus. Motivating variables alter the probability of a response. When we start to get thirsty, we are more likely to ask for water, and we get thirstier and thirstier and thirstier. If we are out all day in the hot sun, we're just dying for a glass of water or some other beverage. So probability again, motivation. Extinction reduces the probability of a response. It doesn't kill the response. It doesn't erase it from a repertoire. It reduces the probability in that context. When we prompt a child, we're increasing the probability of a target response. When there are competing behaviors going on, they reduce the probability of a response. So response probability is fundamental to Skinnerian analysis. And we sometimes use the word response strength and sometimes the phrase response probability. They're kindred concepts, but they have slightly different uses. We tend to speak of response probability with respect to a future behavior. We speak of response strength with respect to present behavior or a present state of the organism, perhaps. I have a mnemonic for myself here to mention Jeopardy. Suppose Alex Trebek says, okay, for $1 billion, the capital of Turkmenistan, and you grab your buzzer and you slam your finger on the buzzer and you say, Ashgabat, Ashgabat. The response has great strength, but it doesn't make sense to talk about it as an emitted response as having a probability. I mean, it occurred. The probability is 1. It's not on a scale. So with an emitted behavior, we can talk about response strength, but we're not likely to talk about response probability. Nevertheless, the two concepts are very intimately related. In fact, they're probably the same concept fundamentally, but the term we use depends on our ignorance of the relevant variables. Sadly, Alex would say, I'm sorry, the correct answer is, what is Ashgabat? And your $1 billion goes down the drain. You probably knew that before I told you. Skinner says, every verbal response may be conceived of as having my mug is, at any moment, a particular probability of emission, its strength. At any moment, some responses are more likely to occur than others. A latent response with a certain probability of emission is not directly observed. It's a scientific construct, but it enormously increases our analytical power. By a latent response, he means it's in your repertoire in the sense that you have a history with respect to this word, this response. It's not sufficiently strong at the moment to be emitted at this particular time. Well, the interesting cases are those in which a response has some substantial strength, but not quite sufficient strength to be emitted under present conditions. We all recognize the tip of the tongue phenomenon, where you know it, and it's just bursting to come out. You can't quite get your tongue around it, so to speak. Well, the concept of latent behavior will loom large in what follows. We assume that the strength of a response must reach a certain value before the response will be emitted. This value is called the threshold. So the strength of a response, the probability of response rises and rises and rises until it reaches a certain point at which it's actually emitted. We call that the threshold. Our independent variables contribute toward that value, even though the threshold might not be reached. So if you've already forgotten the capital of Turkmenistan, I could say, what is the capital of Turkmenistan? And you say, oh, I know this, you just told us. but it might not, you might not be there. You might not quite get it. Um, so a variable strengthens the response, but doesn't necessarily bring it to the threshold. We also need to consider values above the threshold. This is Skinner speaking. It's especially important when we consider the pooling of separate variables. So again, in the Jeopardy example, the fact that Alex Trebek is offering you $1 billion, the fact that you're on TV, the fact that this is something you know, so to speak, these are all they're urging you to shout it out ahead of your fellow contestants. So it's emitted with vigor that's considerably greater than necessary to get the point across. You don't merely say, "What is Ashgabat?" You say, "What is Ashgabat?" And give me my million, or billion, as the case may be. And Skinner goes on to say, it's only when we can conceive of responses varying in strength along a continuum between 0 and the threshold or beyond that we can make any effective use of functional relations. These lines were taken from the William James lectures, which was a kind of rough draft of verbal behavior. So it must be the case that there's continual response competition between incompatible verbal responses. A particular circumstance might cause us to say big, large, massive, huge, bulky, humongous. All of these things might be evoked by some large object. And they're all evoked simultaneously in the sense that we are likely to say huge in the presence of something big. We're more likely to say massive in the presence of something big, large, big, and so on. We can't say them all at the same time. We might not say any of them, but if we do say one, it's at the expense of the others. So they are all rising in probability simultaneously, but one is stronger than the other for some incidental reason. Maybe it's just a more familiar word. We're more likely to say something is large than something is bulky. We're likely to say it's large than massive. But there are other conditions under which we're more likely to say massive than large. The point is that the behavior we actually see, the behavior that's actually emitted, is just the tip of an iceberg, potential behavior, some of which might be just below the surface, in the sense that a very trivial variable might have caused us to say huge instead of large, huge instead of big, or bulky instead of big. So, what are our probability measures? Well, one of them is rate of response. This is very useful to us in the laboratory, where a response can be emitted again and again and again and again. So if you have a thimble, you're very, very thirsty, and all you have is a thimble to drink out of, you'll take many, many, many thimbles full of water. But more likely you just have a single glass of water and guzzle it down in one gulp. So rate of response is not appropriate under many conditions, but it is very useful in the laboratory when an animal can press a lever and get little bits of food rationed out to it. But what we see is that rate of response is affected by reinforcement. Now, verbal behavior has a rate, but we tend not to repeat ourselves unless our listener can't hear us. So if we say something in a crowded restaurant and our listener looks puzzled or cocks their hand behind their ear or says what, we will repeat ourselves. Same thing with being on the telephone. If the connection is lousy, you might find yourself repeating yourself because you're unsure if the other person is heard. But generally, rate of response is not that useful in verbal behavior because once we tell someone something, for example, we tell a person a joke and they laugh heartily. Well, laughing at a joke is reinforcing, but we don't tell them the same joke. Why not? We don't tell them the same joke because they've already heard it and they're not going to laugh a second time. We've learned that people don't laugh twice at the same joke. But if you're a professional comedian, you tell the same joke every night at the club because it's a different audience. So rate of response is relevant in verbal behavior, but it's not the only thing in only game. Latency, how quickly we respond. To Alex Trebek, we respond as fast as we can because we're trying to beat out the other two people. The force of the response, how loudly we shout it. Its resistance to extinction, its tendency to beat out competing responses, again, large, big, bulky, huge, massive, and so on. Its tendency to win in the face of competition. These are all examples of probability measures that are available to us as behavior analysts. There are physiological underpinnings to behavior that put an empirical foundation, an independent empirical foundation under our concept of probabilities or strength. That is, the connections at synapses, the number of connections, the number of receptors on the dendrites on the downstream side of synapses, the amount of neurotransmitter that is being squirted at the synapse, the number of terminal buttons at the synapse or at the end of the axons. These are all things that vary with reinforcement, and they are things that, in a sense, explain why reinforcement increases the probability of behavior. Okay, so we've moved on to the additivity of stimulus control. This is our third topic in our series. My first chapter, so to speak, was how to read verbal behavior. The second is on response probability. Now we're turning to the additivity of stimulus control. Response probability is additive, says Skinner. And he's right. If two stimuli tend to evoke the same response topography, then the response probability increases when both stimuli are presented simultaneously or in close connection. So the first work in this area was, again, in the study of reflexes. Charles Sherrington, who got the Nobel Prize in 1931 or 32 for his work, noticed that there was a law of summation. That is, if you have a subthreshold stimulus that doesn't evoke a reflex, but you repeat that stimulus, bing, 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 the reflex is likely to occur. That is, the adding together of separate probes to the taps on the tendon or puffs to the eyelid. If a very weak puff to the eye doesn't evoke a blink, repeating that puff is likely to do so. Repeating a puff from the right and a puff from the left, both hitting the same eye, will evoke a response that each one alone might not. And there can be responses that cause you to flex your limb or to extend your limb. And if the stimulus comes in both directions, the force of your reflex will be kind of the sum of the two inputs. That is, you will respond weakly or strongly depending on how the two variables interact. So it has the roots in the study of reflexes again. Waving a hand and sounding a tone, neither one might evoke an eye blink, but if the tone is loud enough and the hand is close enough and the two occur together, it might evoke an eye blink. again, the additivity of the two sources of control. This is kind of intuitive. You would expect additivity to occur because you're in effect increasing the strength of a stimulus by presenting two together. Extensions to operant behavior. We're going to play a game now. I'm calling it the intraverbal game, where I'm going to, I want to evoke in you a target response. And I'm going to give you hints as to what that target response is. And you'll find that the probability of that target response gets higher and higher and higher. Well, our first one is male. Famous. Beard. Dead. Controversy. Born February 12th, 1809. Okay, now some of you are beginning to think, ooh, it might be so-and-so, it might be so-and-so. I'm going to give you a final clue. Stovepipe hat. You say Abraham Lincoln. Maybe you don't say Abraham Lincoln because these weren't sufficient, but you can see how someone might say Abraham Lincoln, particularly if they knew February 12th is Abraham Lincoln's birthday. And until when I was a kid, we used to celebrate Lincoln's birthday, February 12th. So it was salient to me, less so to people these days. But still a dead, famous, bearded guy who was involved in a controversy, born in the 1800s, might have evoked Abraham Lincoln with weekly. The stovepipe hat kind of clinches it. You can see how the strength increases over time. I'm going to repeat it now. This is a curious thing. Male, famous, beard, dead, controversy, born February 12th, 1809. Abraham Lincoln, you're saying, Abraham Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln. The last clue is natural selection. And of course, the answer is Darwin. Believe it or not, Charles Darwin and Abraham Lincoln were both born on February 12th, 1809. It's one of the most amazing, well, people are born all the time, but still they're kind of salient heroes to people like me. Well, that's an instant, this is an example of a kind of 20 questions sort of progress where a response becomes likelier and likelier and likelier as you give cues. And the point is that each one by itself might be insufficient to evoke the response. You're not likely to shout Abraham Lincoln just because I say male or famous or beard. If I said male, famous, beard, Civil War, you might very well shout Abraham Lincoln, but you also might say Sherman or Ulysses S. Grant and so on. So this leads us to an interpretation of behavior that looks something like this. If we think of response probability as a kind of y-axis here with a very, very low probability being at the bottom of the page and very high probability being at the top of the page, we have a big sea of latent behavior. That is all the behavior in our history, in our repertoire, with very, very low probability. But some of it is not zero. Some of that latent behavior is kind of bubbling up because of hints. I say male, and so you start thinking of males, but it doesn't rise to the point at which you're actually saying any particular person. But at some point, there's the probability reaches a threshold, and that threshold leads us to actually emit the behavior. So the solid line in the middle of this page represents the threshold of emission. When a response becomes strong enough to actually be emitted, it passes this threshold. Now, it might be that the response is emitted covertly, or it might be the response is emitted overtly. And the line between covert and overt is a dashed line because it depends on the tools of the observer. if we have someone hooked up to an electromyograph device that can detect tiny muscle movements, we can detect very slight incipient behavior that would be invisible to a person without such a device. We often speak to ourselves covertly, or we speak out loud overtly, and there it might seem as though the line is sharper, but even things that we say, so to speak, out loud will be covert if our observer is on the other side of the room or down the road a quarter of a mile. So for your behavior to be overt to someone who's down the road a quarter of a mile, you have to shout. And even then, a quarter of a mile, maybe an eighth of a mile. So the line between overt and covert is not some kind of magic sharp line. It's a fuzzy line. But this is our scheme of response probability. So our repertoire can be thought of as an enormous set of responses, most of which are quiescent, because nothing in the environment is causing them to come to the surface. But our repertoire is continually being stirred up by ambient stimuli. Many responses rise and fall in probability simultaneously. They rise in probability simultaneously, and then they fall again without actually being emitted. So some verbal cue causes us to tend to say large and big and massive and so on. But then life goes on, and the size of something, we say it's large, and then we go on to other things, and those other responses no longer are relevant, and they tend to die back in probability. Some responses get strengthened a second time before they fall back to baseline. And incompatible responses can't both be emitted. There's a kind of winner takes all thing that goes on with the responses. The strongest response gets emitted and other responses get shoved aside. There may be some inhibitory processes going on here, but they're beyond the scope of this talk. So here's a view of the repertoire that I have cooked up. It's a kind of simmering cauldron of responses, of operants. That they rise and fall in probability. They're continually being stirred up by stimuli, and they are in competition with one another. They're trying to, but they, in effect, they're elbowing one another aside. A strong response is emitted at the expense of other behavior. I didn't change the venue. I turned up the volume on my computer, so it may be slightly different for you from here on out. So you may want to adjust the volume on yours. Okay, I'm talking about the role of response probability in problem solving here. I gave a student of mine a little pop quiz. It's my pet example. I told her that the square root of 841 is an integer, and asked her what it is. Now, the point is that a question like this coming out of the blue has some effect on the probability of a whole host of responses in your repertoire. If this were you, let me put it to you, the question to you. The question increases the probability that you will emit some behavior, some numerical sort of answer. That is, you might just, you're more likely to say 160 than you are Fig Newton or tarantula. So the probability of number answers goes up. But which one? There's an infinite number of integers. It's anybody's guess if you're just guessing. She said, well, it's less than 100. And I said, how do you know that? She said, well, it must be less than 100 because 100 times 10 would be 1,000. So 100 times 100 would be way too big. So now with one stroke, she has added a stimulus. She's added a supplementary stimulus that's altered the probability of her answers, restricted it to 100 numbers, down from an infinite number of numbers, which is a big savings. And she continues on, well, 50 times 50 is 2,500, so it must be smaller than 50. Now she's reduced it down to 50 numbers. 10 times 10 is 100. So she's now got it down to 40 numbers. 20 times 20 is 400. That's too small. These are things, these are little problems she can do in her head. And simply by providing these additional prompts to herself, she's able to winnow down the universe of possible answers. And the consequent effect on her repertoire is that she's increasing the probability of numbers in some range and reducing the probability of all other kind of verbal responses. She continues, 30 times 30 is 900. She says, 900, that's close. It's between 20 and 30. So with just a few supplementary prompts, she's now winnowed it down to 10 numbers. And I would be happy if she just stopped there and said it was 20 something, but she was able to continue on. She said, well, it could be this, it could be that. It's close to 900, she said. So it must be in the high 20s. Now, for my money, this would be good enough if she just said it's a number in the high 20s, because that's very close. That is correct. It is a number in the high 20s. And she noticed that it would have to end in a 1, and only 29 times 29 would end in a 1. So she says it must be 29, and she is correct. So let's look at how we interpret this in terms of our response probability. If we think of response probability as this y-axis here, this from low to high as we go from bottom to the top, and up at the top there's the threshold of emission where she actually says something. When I pose a problem that requires a numerical answer, I increase the probability of numerical responses in her repertoire. As I say, she's more likely to say 55 than she is some other non-numerical response. But the vast majority of the responses in her repertoire remain rock bottom low, extremely low probability under these conditions to say something of that sort. So as she continues to prompt herself, these responses, some responses, numerical responses, become higher and higher probability. When she says less than 100, she's reduced the universe of possible responses substantially. When she gets down to between 20 and 30, we just have a small handful of responses that have a probability, but the probability has now gone up. She's much more likely to say a number in the 20s than she was in the beginning. Finally, she's down to 28 and 29, numbers in the high 20s. And she notices that it has to end in a 1, so 29 gets the final boost and 28 falls in probability. So this is a kind of metaphorical view of response probability. And the reason it's that it's shaped like a flask here with a small bottleneck at the top is that you can't say 28 and 29 at the same time. You have to say 28 or 29. Each response is in competition with other responses. That's why I've made the bottleneck small like that, so that one verbal response can go through at a time. Now, this is just a metaphor. It's not an actual description of what the nervous system is like, but it captures this concept of response probability. Let's continue on to applications in applied behavior analysis. Well, what this student has done to herself is what we do with our clients. If a response is made likely by our task at hand, then we may not need to do anything. Maybe the response will just occur. But if the response doesn't occur, what do? Well, we prompt the response, and we fade the prompts. First, we provide a substantial prompt, and then we reduce the strength of the prompt till it's just what is necessary to get the response to occur. And we may transfer control from the prompt to the stimulus. In fact, we do. We transfer the control from the prompt to the independent variable by fading our prompts until they disappear entirely. And then in those conditions, the response occurs without any support at all. So I'm moving on to multiple control. I've labeled it mistakenly number 2. That's not correct. Multiple control is basically a continuation of the concept of response probability. We define our elementary verbal operants in terms of the lines of fracture in basic behavioral processes. For example, a man is defined in terms of a motivating variable. In the presence of a motivating variable, a manned response will lead to a characteristic reinforcement. So if someone is quite thirsty, the response milk is characteristically reinforced by the delivery of milk. So this is the basic man that everyone is familiar with. The tact, we have an antecedent stimulus of some sort. The response occurs under the control of that antecedent stimulus, and there's differential generalized reinforcement. So in the presence of a rooster, the child says rooster, and we say, yes, that's a rooster, or something equivalent. In the presence, it's a differential generalized reinforcement. So in the presence of a hen, the child says a rooster, we say, no, that's not a rooster, that's a hen. So the man and the tact follow the lines of fracture of these behavioral processes of reinforcement and discrimination. In the echoic, we have an auditory verbal stimulus, a vocal response that is point to point, that matches point to point the auditory verbal stimulus, and generalized reinforcement for doing so. So in the presence of an audience that says a rooster, the child says a rooster, and we say, yes, that's right. That's the right word. But verbal behavior is usually under multiple control. The two diagrams I've just shown you show control by simple stimulus control. But Skinner says 2 facts emerge from our survey of mans and tacts and interverbals and so on. First, that the strength of a single response may be, and usually is, a function of more than one variable. And 2, a single variable usually affects more than one response. We call these convergent and divergent multiple control. Convergent and divergent multiple control. And these are Jack Michael's terms for this. These are not Skinner's terms. Skinner came up with the division into these 2 types of control, but Jack Michael gave them names. Jack Michael is an elder statesman in the field. Convergent multiple control is the name we give to multiple stimuli controlling a common response. So if we hear the barking of a dog, we might say dog. If we look around a corner and we see a tail wagging, we might say, oh, that's a dog. If we see a dog from a distance, the shape of a dog, we would say dog. If we hear if all 3 occur together, the stimulus control is additive, and the response dog is even stronger than it would be with any one of these. Any one of these might occasion the word dog, saying dog, but together they add their strength together. So the response becomes stronger. Divergent multiple control is when a single stimulus controls multiple responses. So seeing a dog might occasion our saying golden retriever if it happens to be a golden retriever. It might occasion saying here boy, or it might occasion saying fetch. only one of those three can actually occur, but all of them and many more could be occasioned by the word dog, or rather by the presence of a dog. So divergent and convergent multiple control need to be considered in our analyses. So in the case of our rooster, farmer says rooster when he sees a rooster, and the boy says rooster as well. If this is the first time the boy has ever said rooster, it's an echoic response. And the child can detect that it sounds right. That is, the child knows without being told that he's pronounced rooster correctly, because rooster is the phonemes in rooster, the speech sounds are familiar to the child. It's not a complex task to say rooster when someone else says rooster. In contrast to a foreign word or a complex word where the child might not be sure that he said it right. But the point is that there's some automatic reinforcement, which is hidden by my picture over here. Some automatic reinforcement occurs. The farmer doesn't actually have to say, yes, that's right. In my example, the farmer does say, yes, that's it, rooster. So there's both extrinsic reinforcement and automatic reinforcement. And the reason I bring this up is that we want to, and we'll talk about it more later, it's not necessary to provide extrinsic reinforcement if the child, so to speak, knows he's right. In fact, it may even be detrimental to apply extrinsic reinforcement when the child more or less knows what, as I say, knows that he's right. Because it implies that you don't think he knows that it's right. And so there's a little bit of a social degradation there. Now, at this point, echoic and tact control are both established. The child has learned to say rooster under echoic control in the presence of an actual beast. So now the sight of a rooster evokes saying rooster, and hearing rooster evokes saying rooster. Both kinds of control are established in this single episode of the boy seeing a rooster, hearing the word rooster, saying rooster, and obtaining reinforcement for doing so. Later on, in the presence of a rooster, the farmer says rooster, and the boy says rooster. There's multiple control. There's control by the animal, and there's control by the antecedent verbal stimulus. So there's multiple control. In this case, it's convergent control. Later on, if the child says rooster and the farmer's not around, the boy says, oh, there's the rooster. Rooster is attacked. It's under control of the animal and not of the verbal stimulus. Now, it's typically the case that it's often the case, not necessarily the case, but it's often the case that there are two sources of control when we're doing man training, rather. If a child is thirsty or has been deprived of liquids, in the presence of a jar of milk or a jug of milk, saying milk is partly under tact control and partly under man control. That is, the presence of the milk evokes some tendency to say milk. The deprivation evokes some tendency to say milk, and the two converge. So even a simple example, which we might think of as classic man, it is a classic man, but it's also an example of multiple control. Now, if the milk were not present, it would be a pure man. But let's move on to this example where we have deprivation plus the sight of milk and in the presence of an audience, of the mother. Any one of these three might occasion a child saying milk, but the three together make it more likely. That is, we seldom man for things when there's no one present. We might, if the deprivation is severe, in a kind of magical man, but typically we man in the presence of other people. So there's three sources of control in this case. We can have interverbal control as well. Suppose the mother says, "Would you like something to drink?" Well, a drink is interverbally associated with the various beverages that we drink, and under these conditions, milk would have 4 sources of control. And we can add an echoic, deprivation plus the sight of milk plus the mother plus "would you like something to drink?" Iced tea, orange juice, and milk, a little echoic influence there. We now have 5 sources of control. Now the point is, we shouldn't neglect all the various sources of control. The task is not to classify something as a mand or a tat. Our task is to identify the sources of control of behavior, and there may be, as in this case, there may be 5 sources of control or more, as the case may be. Now, divergent multiple control. Here's a little cartoon of a dog and a cat running. Now, this might occasion saying the dog is chasing the cat. It might occasion that the dog is imitating the cat. Not very likely that you would say that, but it's a possible interpretation of the picture. You could say that the cat is leading the dog out of the woods, for example. So if the cat and dog were lost and the cat hears the can opener operating, the cat may lead the dog out of the woods. The dog and the cat are running is another way of interpreting the picture. They're running to their food dishes, for example, and the cat's just got a head start. The cat is racing the dog. So which version comes to strength depends not on the picture itself, but on other variables. So the picture exerts divergent multiple control, and there are other variables that come to bear just best to select one of these responses as an example of convergent multiple control. So if the speaker is hungry, perhaps the speaker will say the cat and dog are running to their food dishes. If the person just saw kids playing tag, they might interpret the picture as a game of tag, and so on. Now, multiple control, even of the elementary verbal operants, is the rule, not the exception. It's quite unusual for a verbal response to be under pure tat control, man control, interverbal control, and so on. Motivating variables are seldom entirely absent. So there's usually an element of man control. The physical context usually exerts some control, so there's usually some tact control as well. Audience variables are not ubiquitous, but they're nearly ubiquitous. That is, we don't talk much in the absence of an audience. Interverbal control is nearly inevitable in any kind of extended verbal behavior, and any kind of extended passages of verbal behavior. Because words so commonly occur in the presence of other words that there's likely to be some measure of interverbal control. Now, it's useful to classify verbal responses according to a dominant variable, simply to draw our attention, if you will, to this variable and the need to control it if we want to control the behavior. We just don't want to neglect the possible contribution of other variables, but it would be helpful to do so. And there really is no point to debating whether something is really this or really that. Is it really a mand if you say it in the presence of, if you ask for milk in the presence of a milk bottle? It's not really one thing or another. The question is, what are the sources of control? And very often there are multiple examples. Now, joint control is a concept you may be familiar with from coming to this conference. Joint control is a special case of multiple control. Joint control is a phenomenon that is the name we give to a phenomenon when um, a response is under the control of one variable, and a second variable, second independent variable, um, comes online, so to speak, and joins with the first. The addition of a second source of control causes the probability of behavior to increase. So this is useful to us. We can use this strategically in phenomena where we invoke joint control. When you're searching for something, as soon as you see that something, it jumps out at you. That's an instance of joint control. The seeing of the thing and the thinking of the thing that you're seeing both control the behavior of responding to the thing. But when you see it, the seeing of the thing is hot. You're searching for it, and when you see it, there's this jump in response strength. Now, some of you, particularly as you get as old as I am, you start to search for something, then you forget what you're looking for. You start thinking about something else. And it's hopeless to search for something when you're not thinking about that thing. That is, if you let your mind wander, if you stop sort of thinking about the thing you're looking for, then you can walk right by it without it jumping out at you, because there isn't that joint effect of the two sources of control causing a jump in response strength. By thinking about it, I mean, visualizing it or repeating the word and so on. So that jump in response strength is something we learn to recognize as the occasion to stop searching and pick up the object. And we learn to exploit joint control by rehearsing or visualizing or responding in other ways when we're searching for something. In applied settings, this concept of joint control has been used to teach strategic rehearsal and or visualization in children. Vince Carbone, Francesca Delia Espinosa, and others have done research of this sort. Give the child an array of pictures. This is one of the Carbone studies. Give the child an array of pictures. Maybe there's 12 pictures on a desk. And you say to the child, give me the shoes, the fire truck, and the grapes. Now there's 12 pictures there, and the child will may by chance pick up the picture of the fire truck and give it to you, but is more likely then to sit back and say, where are my potato chips? That is, the child is unlikely to succeed in this task unless they learn the strategy of rehearsing. That is, give me the shoes, the fire truck, and the grapes. Each the child would say, shoes, fire truck, grapes, shoes, fire truck, grapes, as they scan the item one by one in turn. When they see a picture of an elephant, there's no joint control. When they see a picture of a car, there's no joint control. When they see a picture of grapes, there's joint control, and they give the picture of the grapes to the experimenter. Go to a more sort of everyday example would be asking a child to go to the kitchen and bring me a napkin, a bowl, and a spoon. And a child is quite likely to go to the kitchen and come back with nothing, unless they learn to strategically rehearse napkin, spoon, bowl, napkin, spoon, bowl. Once they learn to rehearse, they will come back with a napkin and a spoon and the bowl because of this concept, because joint control is a salient event to us, and they learn to respond appropriately by picking the item when joint control occurs. Now, you and I don't have to rehearse necessarily to hear to come back with a napkin, a spoon, and a bowl. Chances are we must, I think, engage in some kind of subtle behavior. Perhaps we visualize it or we echo it once, and that's sufficient for us. But imagine going to the grocery store and having to buy 10 things. Well, we would almost certainly have to rehearse and rehearse and rehearse the 10 things. And of course, we would write them down in a list because it's a nuisance to have to rehearse them. The list provides a second source of control, and this joint control from the list. Teaching children to exploit joint control is a major contribution to the field, and the National Autism Conference is one of the main places where this concept is taught. So you're luckier than most in getting exposed to it. So now I'm going to move on from single operants to sequences of operants. Isolated verbal responses raise relatively few mysteries. And multiple control usually makes our task easier in some ways, in that there are more explanations for why something might occur. But sequences of verbal responses raise plenty of trouble. So I say, I'm putting a big green Granny Smith apple in my lunch bag today. That's something that anyone might say. And it seems simple enough. It's each one of these terms is more or less everyday verbal response under the control of everyday stimuli. But notice that we don't say, I'm putting a green big Granny Smith apple in my lunch bag today. We say big green Granny Smith, but not green big. Why do we say big first and green second? There's no rule that says that big has to come first, is there? But most native speakers of English would say big green Granny Smith apple, not green big Granny Smith apple. Very few people would say, I'm putting a big Granny Smith apple green in my lunch bag today. But in France, the adjective follows the noun, so we might say an apple green rather than a green apple. Yet, why in English what is it that controls our saying big green Granny Smith apple rather than Granny Smith apple green? And of course, there are all sorts of weird things we don't say. I'm putting a lunch bag in my green big Granny Smith apple today. A green am Granny, lunch big I apple Smith today in bag pudding my. Plenty of things we do not tend to say under any conditions. The question is, what controls the order when we say it? So let's turn to our buddy Skinner. What does Skinner have to say? Let's take that animal as a rooster. That animal is a rooster, says Skinner, is more than a tact. The expression contains two tacts, animal and rooster. It also contains additional material serving a function I call, quote, autoclitic. It includes what linguists call syntax or grammar. If we were to stick closely to demonstrated behavioral processes, only the increased probability of saying rooster in the presence of a rooster is the relation called a tact. So I want to guard against the tendency to look for simple explanations. That animal is a rooster. We might say, well, that's a tact, but it's not a tact. It's more than a tact. The tact relationship is the control by a stimulus over a verbal form, animal in the presence of an animal, rooster in the presence of rooster. But all the additional stuff in verbal behavior has to be explained as well. And it's not sufficient to call it simply a tact. Now it could be a tact if that was trained as a unitary response in the presence of a rooster, and the child always says that animal is a rooster, that animal is a rooster, that animal is a rooster, as if it were a single response. But that would be highly abnormal. We would not want a child to treat that animal as a rooster as if it were a single response that always hung together as a unit. We would like the response to be flexible. That animal is a lion, that animal is a dog, and so on. So how do we explain grammar? Grammar comes in here when we are stringing words together in chains like this. Our answer is frames. Now, Skinner called them autoclitic frames. I'm going to try to avoid using that, that term as much as possible, but I do want to, I can't avoid bringing it in. Word order in modern English is largely explained by frames. And as I say, Skinner calls them autoclitic frames because they can't stand alone. In Skinner's taxonomy, an autoclitic is a verbal expression or verbal response that does not stand alone. Rather, it stands in respect to one of the primary verbal operands, one or more of the primary verbal operands. So let's see what Skinner has to say on page 336 of Verbal Behavior. Partly conditioned autoclitic frames combined with responses appropriate to a specific situation, says Skinner. If a speaker has acquired a series of responses, such as the boy's gun, the boy's shoe, and the boy's hat, we may suppose that the partial frame, the boy's X, is available for recombination with other responses. The first time the boy acquires a bicycle, the speaker can compose a new unit, the boy's bicycle. So let's define what an autoclitic frame is. They are strings of words that are commonly heard together. And if you're hearing them for the first time, you echo them. If you don't echo them, then you don't learn them. You hear them and echo them in a characteristic context, with some terms that are fixed and some that vary. The fixed terms are the frame. The boys is the frame and is constant from one example to the next. The variable terms come from the current context, for example, bicycle, and vary from example to example. Here are some examples of frames that are extracted from my own experience with my own kids. Sing X again was an extremely high strength frame in my daughter Lindsay's repertoire. Give me X. Where is the X? Put the Y in the X. Put the Y in the Z. X is a Y. X goes to Y. X gave the Y to the Z. If X, then Y. X is bigger than Y. X is the opposite of Y, under the X, and so on. Now, each frame represents frequent contingencies that just vary in the value of X from time to time. In Sing X again, every time you sing a little song to your 3-year-old, you're going to hear this, this demand that you sing it again. And it could be a different song every night or every occasion. Let's look at the simplest sort of grammar, if you will, the numbering of a spoken sequence. So to start the car, 1, insert key. 2, pump gas once. 3, step on brake. 4, step on clutch. Oops, 4.1, take it out of gear. 5, turn the key counterclockwise to engage the starter. 6, release the key when the engine starts. Now this isn't much of a frame, but notice that the frame is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and the frame is constant from one example to the next, regardless of what the items are. So any sequence of events that you're describing to another person, you might describe them using this kind of frame. First you do this, then you do that, then you do this, then you do that. Okay, well that's a simple frame. Let's look at some other facts about autoclitic frames. frames often specify word order, hence grammar. So sing X again is an imperative sentence. X gave the Y to the Z is a descriptive sentence, a propositional sentence. Under the X is not a sentence, it's a prepositional phrase, but it's a component of a sentence. And within the frame, the word order can't be scrambled. So in the frame X put the Y and the Z, we can't move the fixed terms around. We can't put the word put at the end of the sentence or the end of the frame. We can't put in the between X and Y. Everything has to be in the right order. So the frame sets the order, and the variable terms drop into place in this fixed order. Because these frames are essentially interverbals in the sense that each one is a fixed sequence with these gaps in it, X put the Y in the Z, there's interverbal control between one part of the frame and the next part of the frame. Sing, X, again, again, and sing are interverbally related. They're interrupted by the presence of X, the song that you're supposed to sing again. But there's interverbal control. That's the point. But the autoclitic frames are sorry, my computer has advanced without my permission. I lost my position here. Anyway, well, let me go on. How do autoclitic frames constrain structure? They do so because they're interverbal. That is, interverbals have structure. Interverbals have a formal structure, unlike other verbal operants. You can't substitute other forms, and you can't rearrange them. To be or not to be, that is the aardvark, you just can't do it. In the case of the frame X sent the Y to Z, you can't shift the terms around. You can't say to Henry, the letter sent Louise. Louise sent the letter to Henry. Interverbals have a formal structure, and this is where the formal structure of grammar comes from. It comes from the rigidity of these interverbal or autoclitic frames. The listener responds appropriately only when the order is honored by the verbal community. So the verbal community ultimately determines what will be acceptable and what won't be acceptable. So it's not as if these orders are fixed by nature or by logic. It's simply the customs of the verbal community that establish these frames as the way to say something of a particular sort. If you want someone to sing something again, you say sing X again. You don't say again X sing. Although in a different verbal community, you might. In France, you say apple green, and in English, you say green apple. The functional feature of interverbals is the structure. Because you can't change the interverbal, an interverbal relationship. An interverbal necessarily has structure. And so these frames are usually dominated by one distinctive response, and the other elements are common to many frames. So the X sent the Y to the Z. The word send is kind of bossy. Send requires that that X is someone who sends, Y is something that can be sent, and Z is something that can receive something sent. The doctor sent the prescription to the pharmacy. The teacher sent an angry letter to the boy's parents. These these dominant forms that seem to control multiple variables in verbal behavior are traditionally called verbs. Now, it's not a one-to-one relationship. You can't say it's a bossy term, therefore it's a verb, but it's quite reliable. The variable terms tend to be called nouns. Now, I'm not saying that verbs and nouns are identical to these the positions in the autoclitic frames, but there is a correlation here. I went through a lexicon of English verbs on the internet. Someone came up with a list of 2,941 verbs, and I went through that list and found that about 88% of them typically appear in characteristic autoclitic frames. X gave the Y to the Z, X abandoned Y, X predicted Y, X proves Y, X coincides with Y, X sent the Y to the Z. So these are verbs usually do require this kind of allocation of function to position. The exceptions are verbs of being and other verbs of that sort. Accounting for the stimulus control within autoclitic frames, I regret that my picture is in your way here. I can't seem to be able to move it out. Skinner says the filling in of autoclitic frames is not simply the emission of two responses separately acquired. The process resembles the multiple causation of chapter 9. So once again, multiple causation creeps into our analysis. Grammar is not simply a matter of first A, then B, then C, then D, then E. There is a process of multiple causation that's going on. The relational aspects of the situation strengthen a frame. So let's say X is bigger than Y. Specific features of the situation strengthen the responses fitted into it. So X, the elephant is bigger than the mouse. Not the mouse is bigger than the elephant. The frame itself comes to strength under multiple control. Now, a single circumstance can evoke many incompatible responses, and which response is actually emitted depends upon the contribution of additional variables. So, returning to our case of the dog and the cat, we already talked about how we might say the dog is racing the cat, or the dog is chasing the cat, or the cat is leading the dog, and so on. The picture isn't sufficient. Which one comes to strength depends on these other variables. Okay, I'm a babe in the woods at this computer technology, so I had to go in and move the headings over to the left so that it wouldn't interfere with my mug up here in the upper right. I didn't realize it was going to look like this when it was recorded. In any case, we've covered the topics of response probability, the additivity of stimulus control, autoclitic frames, and multiple control. And these are all features of Skinner's book that are beyond the elementary verbal operants classes. And now we're turning to a topic that pervades Skinner's discussion from page 1 to the very end of the book, the topic of automatic reinforcement. He doesn't devote a chapter to this or any special focus to it, but it's clear that he considers this to be an important aspect of verbal behavior. So let's look at a couple of examples of automatic reinforcement. For children who have very, very low baseline repertoires of vocalization, it's difficult to shape their behavior into something more functional if they don't make any speech sounds at all, or do so at a very low rate. The stimulus pairing procedure is a procedure that was pioneered by Mark Sundberg, in which speech sounds are paired with an unconditioned reinforcer, with the idea that they would then acquire reinforcing properties themselves. So when the child emits those responses by chance, it's reinforcing because the child is producing a sound which has been paired with a valuable reinforcer. So it works something like this. The experimenter might pick a speech sound such as ah, or ooh, or ba, and repeatedly say it, ah, 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 and then tickle the child or bounce them in a blanket or give them a scoop of ice cream or something that the child likes. So the sound ah becomes paired with this consequence and acquires conditioned reinforcing properties on its own. Now, when the child says ah, he's producing a sound which has become valuable to the child, has some excitement to the child, and it presumably will reinforce the child saying that. Well, the empirical data suggests that this is true. It's not reliably true because not all kids respond the same way, and it's quite a painstaking procedure. Nevertheless, it has been shown to increase the baseline rate of these target responses, which then allows the experimenter to seize on these and begin shaping more functional verbal behavior from these incipient speech sounds. So the pioneering work was done by Sundberg, Yoon Bennett, and some others. As they say, it's not uniformly effective. Some people have had trouble getting an effect. It's not terribly surprising given the complexity of the procedure and the number of variables that have to be controlled and so on, that there should be some variability. The first reference that I have found to this concept is actually from Skinner himself, not surprisingly. Skinner says in 1937, in verbal behavior, for example, we may give a sound reinforcing value through classical conditioning. Any sound produced by a child which resembles it is automatically reinforced. So this is the notion of automatic reinforcement. That is that the child, that the reinforcement is not mediated by some parent or caregiver, but is directly supplied by the stimulus properties of the behavior itself. So when a person sits down at the piano or with a guitar or is humming a tune or something, if you're noodling around on the piano, you might play a few chords that sound good together, and that might lead you to embellish it into a song or a tune. It's not mediated by other people. It's directly mediated by the stimulus properties of your own behavior, stimulus products of your own behavior. Now, the implications are that the automatic shaping of response form can occur in the absence of a caregiver. So if a child in his or her crib has come to appreciate the speech sounds of its parents, then babbling in the crib could be shaped into closer and closer approximations of the kinds of sounds that the child is used to hearing. And indeed, this seems to be the case. Children who babble will babble all kinds of sounds initially, but they begin to home in on the speech sounds that are characteristic of their own verbal community and stop making those speech sounds that are characteristic of other languages. Now, it's likely that discrimination is going to be quickly set up. That is, a child who's expecting to get tickled or bounced in a blanket will discover soon enough that making a speech sound does not lead to being tossed in a blanket. So in the absence of follow-up procedures, this kind of automatic reinforcement is not likely to have enduring effects unless the child is continuing to get these kinds of pairings through the natural environment. A second kind of automatic reinforcement is something I've given the name achieving parity with the practices of the verbal community. And this is how it works. Children become discriminating listeners before they become articulate speakers. That is, you can tell a child to, go into the kitchen and tell mommy that there's someone at the door, and the child will toddle in and I guess we're talking about nonverbal children, so the child's not going to tell mommy this, but the child will go in and tug mommy on the apron. So children learn to respond to speech before they can speak it themselves. But when they begin to speak, they can hear themselves, assuming that they have normal hearing. Now, if the stimulus properties of their speech, that is, if what they hear themselves say, evokes a tendency to behave in themselves that matches what what they do in response to other people, then they've matched. In other words, they can tell when they've said it right, because it sounds right. That is, they can tell when it sounds right. How they tell is that the sounds produce discriminative behavior in themselves. Matching is a reinforcer. And I have a little anecdote of my own experience that illustrates the process. My older daughter, Lindsay, when she was 2.5 or 3 years old, had a xylophone with different colored plates and so on. And she would bang away on the xylophone all happily by herself. And there was one period for about 3 days in a row when she was banging away on the xylophone again and again and again and again. And what she was doing was learning to play supercalifragilisticexpialidocious on the xylophone. And entirely without any suggestion on our part, this is what she tried to do. And over the course of those 3 days, she got better and better and better. And pretty soon she could play it essentially, flawlessly as a 3-year-old could, without the slightest intervention on our part. Now this makes sense. I mean, none of you are surprised by this. The point is that the reinforcement was entirely generated by the product of her own behavior. And speech has that same virtue, that the child can respond, can identify when speech is correct and when it's not correct. Okay, let's see if I can scroll down here. All right. Did I go too far? No, okay. Now the word parody, why is it called parody and not imitation? That may have been a poor choice of terms because most people don't have an intuitive idea of what it means. The point is that the stimuli don't have to be identical. If I play a sequence of notes on the piano and you play the same sequence of notes on the oboe, you're not imitating me, because the sounds, first of all, the behaviors are quite different. The behavior of playing an oboe is quite different from the behavior of playing a piano. The sounds aren't the same, because the sound of a piano isn't the same as the sound of an oboe. What's the same is they achieve a comparable effect on the listener. So you're getting the same effect, not necessarily the same topography or the same precise stimulus properties. So this is what's reinforcing. It's getting that same effect that's reinforcing. And I called it parody, and for better or worse, we're sort of stuck with it. Well, we're not stuck with it, but that's the term I use. How does it develop? When you don't know what to do in life, the surest way to a happy result is to do what other people do. And children start out life not knowing how to do anything, really. I mean, they know how to do their innate behavior, but they don't know whether they've been born in the 13th century. They don't know whether they've been born in the 20th century, the 21st century, the 40th century. For all they know, they're being born into caveman life. They have to figure out how the world works. And the fastest way to do that is to watch how other people who have experience in the world, how they work. And it's usually the case that doing what other people do leads to reinforcement, because other people do what leads to reinforcement. They've acquired behavior that leads to reinforcement, and so it's a good idea to model yourself after others if you have no idea how to do it yourself. Now, of course, there's a limit to this. We like to go beyond our parents and our ancestors and so on in some ways, but for an infant, achieving parity is a good idea. It's not the case that the stimulus properties of the utterance. This thing keeps shifting ahead on me. Sorry, I don't know why it rolls ahead without being bidden. It's not the case that the stimulus properties of the utterance itself are reinforcing, but the fact that you've matched. So you can, if someone plays some horrible tune and says, "I bet you can't do that," you can play that same horrible tune, even if it sounds awful. The fact that you're matching is what's exciting, not the fact that the thing sounds wonderful intrinsically. So matching becomes conforming to the behavior of others becomes a reinforcer in many contexts. In some contexts, it's a punisher, but in many contexts, matching the behavior of other people is reinforcing, and that's what's going on here in language acquisition. Implications are that automatic reinforcement is ideally poised to bring about the shaping of verbal behavior because it's immediate and it's reliable. And there's a zillion of these contingencies. They occur every time we speak. We don't have to wait for other people to come around and say, "Good job," or "That's right." So unlike social reinforcement, it's immediate, it's reliable, and it happens every time. Now, it may explain the acquisition of grammatical behavior in the absence of explicit parental instruction. And this is one of the big mysteries about language acquisition. How is it that kids learn to speak so doggone fast and so well without parents sitting them down and saying, "Now, Johnny, the subject of the sentence comes first, and then the verb, and then the direct object comes next, and if there's an indirect object, that comes last." But with some verbs, the indirect object can come right after the verb. You know, we don't give our kids instruction of this sort. Nobody gives their kids instruction of this sort, except maybe some, weird parents who want their kids to go to Harvard. But nevertheless, kids learn to speak without any explicit training in grammar. Now they speak in conversational lingo. That is, they don't speak the way a professor would write necessarily. For better or worse, they don't speak that way. But they speak in perfectly orderly ways that are grammatically correct in their verbal community. We're not talking about grammar in the sense of a 6th grade school teacher. We're talking about the natural grammar of the language. Somehow kids learn to do that, learn it without being instructed. Well, here's an example of a puzzling kind of grammatical regularity that I'm sure none of you have given a moment's thought to. A guy named Peter Gordon did an experiment with 3-year-old kids. And he was investigating whether 3-year-old kids could master a kind of formation of novel compound nouns. So you would take a little 3-year-old and show him puppets, and different puppets were like Muppet monsters. And you would say, "This monster eats mud. He's a mud eater." "What kind of monster is he?" And the child would say, "A mud eater." Right, he eats mud. He's a mud eater. Now this monster over here, he eats mice. He invites the child to say what he is. And the child says, a mice eater. Right, he's a mice eater. Now what the child has done is made a novel compound noun, mice eater, out of the fact that this little beast eats mice. It's possible that the child has heard the word mice eater before, but it's not terribly likely. Give or take. The point is that the child has correctly, from our point of view, formed this compound noun. Now we go to things that are definitely novel. Gordon says, right, he's a mice eater. This one eats books. The child says, a book eater. Now it's quite certain that the child has never heard the word book eater before. So the child has come up with this compound noun on his own. But moreover, the child has done something surprising. He's dropped the S. He doesn't say it's a books eater. He says it's a book eater. And this is the way you and I speak. When we form a compound noun from a plural noun and some suffix, we drop the S. And this is just baffling because obviously no one has told the child to drop the S. The question is, why does the child drop the S? And this has led Gordon and Noam Chomsky and others to insist that language must be innate. That is, the grammar of the language has to somehow have innate constraints because nobody tells children things like this and nobody teaches children things like this. Well, I'm not a big fan of innate explanations of things unless there's some obvious survival value that attends to it. And there must be some evolutionary contingency that explains innate behavior. And it's hard to think of an evolutionary contingency that would support dropping your S when you're making a compound noun. And I wasn't ready to give up on environmental or experiential explanations. So I had at my disposal 2 3-year-olds, my own kids, on whom I experimented. They were simultaneously 3. I did it when Lindsay turned 3, and then later on when Robin turned 3. I replicated it. So what I did with them was to reinforce, so to speak, the standard usage. That is, I reinforced reinforced dropping the S, which is what is standard in our culture. But what I modeled was non-standard usage. I modeled retaining the S. I say recall the Brown and Hanlon study showing paucity of explicit reinforcement in parent-child interactions. Now, we didn't actually go over this earlier, but I had hoped to do so. Anyway, Brown and Hanlon showed that parents don't do a lot of explicit instruction of the grammar of their language with their kids. So what Brown and Hanlon looked at was explicit reinforcement in the form of good job or attaboy or have some ice cream or the kinds of reinforcers that we manipulate in applied settings where we explicitly reinforce some target behavior. Brown and Hanlon found that parents don't do a lot of explicit, well, they do a lot of explicit reinforcement, but not at the level of word endings and so on. They don't say, oh, good job, you added an ing there. Here's a cookie. So that supported this notion that the grammar must be innate. Well, in any case, I reinforced dropping the S, but I modeled retaining the S. And this is what I got. This monster eats mud. He's a mud eater. This one eats wood. What's he? He's a wood eater, says Lindsay. Right, he's a wood eater. He eats wood. Now, wood doesn't have a plural, so it's a good place to start because you get the child, thinking that you just add eater to the word to make the compound. Now, this one eats mice. He's a mice eater, says Lindsay. Now, mice is an irregular plural. It doesn't end in an S, and so there's no S to drop. So mice eater is what you and I would say as well. Right, he's a mice eater because he eats mice. Now, this one eats chipmunks. He must be she says, a chipmunk eater. So for the first time in her life, presumably, she has formed a compound noun, something eater, by taking a plural noun, dropping the S, and adding eater to it. So she's behaved just the way Peter Gordon's subjects behaved. She dropped the S, just as you and I would drop the S. But how did she know to drop the S? Well, that's a good question. But in any case, what did I do? I said right. I said right. In other words, I nominally reinforced chipmunk eater. And the reason I'm saying right, the reason I'm giving feedback of this sort, is I want to point out how irrelevant explicit reinforcement can be in some contexts. Obviously, as a behavior analyst, I think reinforcement is where it's at. But there are many occasions in which saying right simply doesn't serve a reinforcing function, even though you might expect it to. He said, right, he's a chipmunks eater because he eats chipmunks. This one eats marbles. He's a marble eater, she said. And there were a number of examples that I'm leaving out here. I say, right, he's a marbles eater. This one eats chickens. He's a chicken eater, she says. Yes, that's right, he's a chickens eater. Now, this one eats worms. What's he? A worms eater, she says. And I continued with a few more examples of this as well. But eventually I switched back on her. I said, right, he's a worm eater. This one eats candles. He's a candles eater, she says. Right, he's a candle eater, I said. This one, wait, she said, you say candle eater, but I say candles eater. So clearly what is going on here is that she has detected the discrepancy between what she said and what I said, and she's conforming to the way I say it. Now, this is entirely without any direct encouragement on my part, in the face of my saying right for saying it her way. So the right had no obvious effect on her behavior except as a kind of social lubricant. It just keeps the game going. But what's of value to her is the fact that what she was saying was not the same thing as what I was saying, and she wanted to jump ship. So that illustrates the power of automatic reinforcement in language acquisition. It does not explain why she drops the S. I don't know why she drops the S in such cases. It must be the case that there are examples of some form of that sort that that guides her behavior, their behavior. But I don't know. I can't justify that with any data. But I don't see any alternative to the notion that the child has learned to do this because of modeling. So a more elaborate empirical example was an experiment I did with Janet Twyman, Sue Silvestri, and Amy Lackey-Davies, Amy Davies-Lackey, rather, from the Fred Keller School some years ago. We wanted to see if we could use the same automatic reinforcement strategy to teach a more complex grammatical construction. And we chose the active versus the passive construction. The active voice, as you probably know, is the subject comes first, the direct object comes last, and the verb is in the middle. The dog is chasing the cat. The subject is verbing the object. The passive voice is the Z is being wide by the X. The cat is being chased by the dog. So we set up an experiment in which, again, without any direct reinforcement for doing so, we tried to get the kids to emit the passive voice through modeling it. Meanwhile, we were actively reinforcing the active voice. So we would show kids pictures like this, and you could either say in the active voice, the elephant is pulling the mouse, or you could say in the passive voice, the mouse is being pulled by the elephant. Now, these were 6 kids ranging from 2.5 to 4.5 years. And 2 of them had developmental disabilities, although they were verbal. Now, the kids of that age are very seldom observed to use the passive voice. This is quite young. And of course, it's impossible to know what experiences a child has had with respect to verbal behavior. You can't go around with a video cam and monitor or measure every exposure. Nevertheless, we could tell that whether kids had the passive construction or not by looking at their behavior. So we showed kids pairs of pictures. This would be a picture of in which the experimenter would say to this picture, the mouse is being pulled by the elephant. That is, we would say, we would use the passive voice. Here, the pig is being pushed by the rat, we would say. Then we flip the easel over to the next picture and invite the child to describe it. And the child would see the action is reversed here. The pig is pushing the rat. The child would invariably describe it in the active voice. The pig is pushing the rat. And we would say, good, that's right. And then we would go to the next picture. We would say, the cat is being brushed by the dog. We would flip over to the next picture, and the kid would say, the cat is brushing the dog. The child would use the active voice. This went on and on and on and on through some 40 pairs of pictures. And what we found was, we would say, over the course of this experiment, children would migrate more and more and more to the passive voice, passive construction. Every one of our 6 children migrated to the passive at least once over the course of the experiment. So the elephant is being pulled by the mouse. Now, this is a case where we were quite confident that the children were saying this for the first time, because over the course of the experiment, we could see the successive approximations to the final product. That is, they didn't say it. They usually didn't say it in one fell swoop, correctly. They would kind of stumble around and get it approximate before they got it perfectly. So once again, we see the acquisition of in this case, fairly complex verbal construction in the absence of any explicit tutelage on the part of the caregivers or parents. So this is an instance of automatic reinforcement. It's also an instance of an autoclitic frame. So we see the combination of the two. The autoclitic frame plus automatic reinforcement leads to the acquisition of this. Moreover, it's an instance of multiple control. The frame was multiply controlled by the picture and by the broader context in which recent examples were modeled. So the picture, in the context of hearing an adult use the passive voice, led the child to use a passive frame in which, a passive autoclitic frame in which the elements of the frame, the variable terms in the frame were supplied by the picture itself. So we see here the integration of those three concepts of automatic reinforcement, autoclitic frames, and multiple control. Now, I think Skinner doesn't get into detail into how these things weave together, and there's still mysteries to be worked out, and he leaves these largely to the reader. The mystery has not been wholly solved, the mystery of language acquisition. Once a frame comes to strength, how is it woven together with variable terms? Because the terms are being emitted in alternating sequence. The X is being wide by the Z. You've got to put the right X in the right position. It matters who's pulling whom. You can't stick your variable terms in the wrong place. So it's not simply a matter of knowing a frame. The variable elephant is being variable pulled frame by the variable mouse. So frame variable, frame variable, frame variable are alternating, and it's an extremely complex performance. And again, the child has to, so to speak, know which element to put where. So there's three texts: elephant, mouse, and pull. Why does a tact fill one of these gaps, but not another? Why don't we say, when we're facing this picture, why don't we say the mouse is being pulled by the elephant, which would be wrong in English. But we could imagine a different language that had different functions in which that would be correct, just as apple green is correct in French, and green apple is correct in English. There's nothing magical or necessary about this. It's just that this is what it means in English. So we have to bring in yet another variable. And a possible clue arises from considering how it would look in Old English. Old English is the autoclitic frame function was served largely by inflections. So nouns and adjectives and verbs, well, nouns and adjectives at least, were marked by number, gender, and case, and the verbs were conjugated in various ways. So in Old English, I'll use a subscript of 1 for the nominative case and 2 for the accusative case. These would be equivalent expressions. So you could say the dog nominative chased the cat accusative. The cat accusative chased the dog nominative would mean the same thing to Alfred the Great. Chased the dog nominative, the cat accusative. Again, when I say dog nominative, I mean dog with a nominative ending, dog with a little subscript, a suffix rather, cat with a suffix that's appropriate to the case endings. The cat the dog chased. All of these case inflections allowed the word order to be scrambled. Modern English evolved in a different way, and the case endings were dropped and word order took their place. I don't know why. I don't suppose anybody knows why, but languages evolve in these ways. Now, what that means is, well, the function of the frame is to assign roles to those placements. That is, the frame has to take over the job of the case endings. So in X sent the Y to the Z, X has to be an actor, someone who's an agent, somebody who does the sending. That's the nominative case. Y has to be something sendable. It has to be something that can be sent, an object of some sort. It has an accusative case. Z has to be some entity that can receive things, a recipient, the dative case. So, so these autoclitic frames come with them a kind of obligation. X agent sent the Y accusative to Z dative. Now, we don't consciously think about these things, but we apparently unconsciously do so. X predicted Y, X is the one who does the predicting, Y is the thing predicted, and so on. Under the X, X has to be some object that can provide shelter, therefore it's in the dative case. So since these case inflections are descriptive, are autoclitics, they tell the listener what the role is. They tell the listener what the role is that are played by these primary verbal operants. The agent, the object, the recipient, the possessor, and so on. So if these inflections used by the Anglo-Saxons, if they serve the same autoclitic function as a word order, they have to be controlled by the same variables. We should be able to use the classification of inflections as a clue to the contingencies governing word order. So we're back to multiple control. To a Saxon, King Arthur and his knights, these roles that I speak of would acquire stimulus control over an appropriate inflection at the time the inflected word was modeled in context. To a modern English speaker, these roles require stimulus control over transitions in autoclitic frames at the time the completed frame is modeled in context. Excuse me a sec. Okay. So we don't just see lines on a page. We don't just see an elephant. We see an elephant enjoying his ride. We see the elephant as the recipient of an action, as the beneficiary of this little scenario. We don't just see a mouse. We see a mouse struggling to haul this huge weight. So that we see the mouse as an actor. We see the elephant as the recipient. We see the pulling as the connection between them. We see these things we don't say them consciously to ourselves. We don't say them out loud. Ooh, the mouse is the puller. But we respond discriminatively to this picture in that way. We interpret the mouse as pulling and the elephant as receiving the action. And if the picture were ambiguous, we might flip back and forth. We might mistake the picture. We may not realize who's doing the pulling. We might interpret it one way, and another person might interpret it another way if the picture were ambiguous. Again, the interpretation of a scene involves these implicitly assigning roles to what we see. Again, we're not assigning a role, but we interpret it in a way where our interpretation includes this notion of a role. And that's what controls the verbal behavior. That's what controls the placement of items in autoclitic frames. So fluent speech is explained by autoclitic frames alternating with the variable terms in a rapid sequence. The frame itself is multiply controlled by a state of affairs and some contextual variables. The tasks within the frames are multiply controlled by the stimulus itself, the interverbal control by the frame, the role of the role of the stimulus is playing in the scenario, the animal that's being acted upon, oops, and okay. So again, there's multiple control going on here. Skinner says that the relational aspects of the situation strengthen the frame, and specific features of the situation strengthen the responses fitted into it. But we've seen that we need a more complete analysis. We need to specify the stimuli that control how the responses are fitted into the frame. So the variable term mouse is inserted in the right sequence in the frame because of the multiple control by the picture, the observer's discriminative responses to the role, and the interverbal control by the frame. So we have the picture of the mouse, we have the part of the frame that calls for the agent of the action, by the X is the X is the agent in this case, and we have discriminative responses of the mouse to the mouse, the picture of the mouse as an agent. Those three things pooled together cause us to say mouse at just the right time. So, to summarize grammar, in the types of examples we've considered here, the stimulus control of rapid transitions between operants and fluent speech can be explained by autoclitic frames that are multiply controlled by relational properties of the context, circumstantial variables that favor one frame over an alternative frame, variable terms that are fitted into the frame. Those variable terms are multiply controlled by tact control by the current context, interverbal control by elements in the frame, and tact control by discriminative responses reflecting the roles of the variable terms. Well, this is a lot to digest in a single frame, in a single slide. It's not, this talk isn't intended to explain grammar. This talk is intended to whet your appetite for reading more of Skinner. I've left out any discussion of prosody. Prosody is the song of speech, the inflections, the emphasis of speech. And that's another variable that participates in the stimulus control of frames, but we don't have time to get into all these things. So I'll leave you with this short summary that fluent speech is under multiple control of the context, audience, previous verbal behavior, and the subtle stimulus properties of our own ongoing behavior, verbal and nonverbal. Okay, so we've talked now about the notion of response probability, how it's fundamental to understanding all behavior, human and non-human, but it's especially relevant to understanding verbal behavior because verbal behavior is so complex. We need to consider this notion of response probability and the additivity of stimulus control. That is that stimulus control is a function of all of the variables that are present at any moment, adding together. Some may be subtracting strength, some are adding strength, but the sum of all this stuff together we need to consider the summative effects of stimulus control. We need to consider automatic reinforcement. We need to consider multiple control. We need to consider autoclitic frames. A few things in Skinner's book are shifting gears slightly. I'll just briefly talk about the speaker as listener and the conditioning of the behavior of the listener. When we speak aloud, we can hear ourselves at least as well as others can hear us. That is, again, assuming that we have normal hearing. We can actually hear ourselves better than other people because the sound is transmitted through the bones of our head as well as through the air. So we have less interference, stronger signal, and of course we're intimately connected to the variables that control our behavior. That is, we're saying something because of some current context. So we're not in doubt as to what we've said. Even when we speak silently, we can respond in a comparable way. So verbal behavior is both a response to current variables, and verbal behavior is part of the constellation of variables controlling subsequent behavior. Notice the paralyzing effect of delayed auditory feedback. If anyone has ever been in a delayed auditory feedback situation where you hear yourself, but the signal, you're hearing yourself over earphones perhaps, but the signal is delayed by half a second or so, it can be extremely difficult to speak under such conditions. You're used to hearing yourself immediately. When you hear yourself with a delay, the stimulus control gets disrupted. So this effective delayed auditory feedback attests to the control that the speaker as listener plays in verbal behavior. And among other things, it permits the automatic shaping of novel forms of response. So the child can acquire the passive voice or acquire some weird rule for compounding nouns. But it also lends fluency to an utterance by adding interverbal control to the other variables responsible for speech. That is, when we hear ourselves say 77, those stimuli are stimuli under which years ago our forefathers and so on. We're supplying the stimuli to ourselves that control subsequent verbal behavior. So reciting long passages of poetry and so on more or less requires that, doesn't necessarily require, but it's facilitated by the speaker as listener. It's especially conspicuous in self-editing. We catch ourselves saying, oops, I didn't mean to say that. I meant to say Massachusetts, not New Hampshire. Or when we're writing and we carefully compose and revise and document. Self-editing is conspicuous in those cases. The stimulus properties of our own speech interact with ambient controlling variables, and we learn to exploit this additional stimulus control in strategic ways to solve problems. So for example, when you're trying to recall someone's name, it sometimes helps to go through the alphabet and say, does it begin with an that is, we try out a whole bunch of first letters, and the stimulus property of that first letter supplements or competes with the control by what other variables are present that are occasioning that response. And it may bring the name to strength. So if we're looking at someone and we can't remember his name, being prompted by the initial letter may help. The concept of speaker as listener is pervasive in the last 6 chapters of the book. There's not a single chapter on this topic. It's just sprinkled throughout Skinner's writing. Skinner discusses composition, self-editing, logic, and thinking. And in all of those cases, the speaker as listener is an important function. We're going to move on to the last topic, conditioning the behavior of the listener. And I'm only going to allude to it here and not explain it. When we ask someone to take the bread out of the oven, when the timer dings, the request appears to transform a neutral stimulus, the sound of the timer, into a discriminative stimulus that will evoke a response. And it seems to do so without any relevant contingencies of reinforcement. Now, this is an illusion. Something is going on when someone gives you a rule, like take the bread out of the oven when the timer dings. That's effective only if you're actively listening. That is, if you're behaving in some distinctive way at the moment of instruction. And even then, it only works if you have a history of learning to respond to similar requests. So the question is, what is the listener actually doing when the listener listens? Listening is more than hearing. To pay attention means to engage in a set of covert listener behaviors such as echoic responses, self-echoics when we rehearse something, imagery, elaboration, related verbal responses. These are the things we teach students to do when they need to learn something. So it's the very behaviors that we engage in without explicit instruction necessarily, when our behavior is conditioned by a verbal rule. So we don't just hear what is said, we respond non-verbally to it. The verbal stimuli bring together these behavioral elements that otherwise occur only by direct experience. So bringing together the ding of the timer with taking the bread out of the oven is accomplished by the verbal stimuli and our discriminative responses to those verbal stimuli. Verbal stimuli cause us to flee from hungry lions, to swim in tropical waters, to brood with Hamlet on the battlements. That is, the verbal stimuli evoke in us the behavior, the imaginative behavior of running away or swimming or stalking the battlements. They aren't simply stimuli that come and go. They have these evocative effects. So verbal behavior is like a connect the dots puzzle. The speaker provides the dots, but the listener engages in the behavior of weaving the dots together into a picture. So it's the listener's collateral behavior that accomplishes the conditioning of his own verbal behavior. Now, Skinner doesn't get into much detail on this. He devotes about 10 pages to the subject. It's an extremely important topic, but it went beyond Skinner's goals. So to summarize my talk, I'm at the end here. I'm at my 2.5 hour point. Just to review what we've covered, our omitted verbal behavior emerges from a kind of competition in which response probability among the behavior in a repertoire plays a role. Response probability among behavior in a repertoire in which the strongest response at any moment wins. I left out a verb there. So the response probability, many responses are fluctuating in strength. The strongest response is the one that's emitted. Response probability arises from the combined contribution of many variables acting together. Its response probability is additive. Pure verbal operants are the exception. Almost all verbal behavior is multiply controlled. Extended strings of verbal behavior occur in orderly ways that we call grammar. Autocratic frames lie at the heart of these orderly relations. Social reinforcement ultimately explains why we speak at all. But much of the fine-grained features of our verbal repertoires arise from automatic reinforcement. Conforming to the practices of the verbal community is ordinarily reinforcing to children, and deviations are punishing. Now, it's true, of course, that there are exceptions when kids love to do things that aren't normal, that are different, and they're reinforcing because they're different. But when the child wants to communicate, so to speak, with his companions, it's important that it's reinforcing when he is understood. So automatic reinforcement is the main engine of language acquisition. If one has normal hearing, the speaker is also a listener to his or her own speech. What we say is highly influenced by what we've just said. Verbal behavior can bring about the conditioning of the behavior of the listener by bringing together disparate discriminative responses on the part of the listener, responses that are ordinarily occasioned by nonverbal stimuli. This brings us to the end of this particular workshop. I've tried to encourage you to take a look at verbal behavior, and if you don't have any interest in slogging through the book, this is a set of topics that Skinner touches on or covers in some depth, depending on the topic. And they're all there in Skinner's analysis, and they're all things that are essential for understanding how verbal behavior works, how it is we come to speak, how it is we come to speak with so little explicit instruction on the part of parents and caregivers. How much of it is practical depends upon the task at hand. That is, if you're working with a child with a very, very limited verbal repertoire, it may be that your main concern is teaching individual responses that serve some important communicative function. So at that level, tasks and mands and interverbables and so on may be the best level to be working at. As children acquire more and more sophisticated verbal behavior, it's important to consider establishing sentence-like verbal behavior that serves a, if nothing else, it serves to make the child feel and appear more like everyone else. And I'm sure that's an important goal for all of us, is to try to get the verbal behavior of our children, the children in our care, to feel accepted, be accepted, and have all the power that that comes from verbal behavior for everyone else. So it's a gradient, and the things I've discussed in this workshop lie at the sort of higher end of that gradient, and you can look to Skinner's verbal behavior for some guidance, or to those of us who have profited from Skinner's verbal behavior vicariously. Thank you very much, and goodbye.